In your mind's eye, you are stepping quietly into a Viking longhouse. The scent of smoked fish lingers gently in the air, interwoven with the earthy aroma of damp wood, straw, and wool. Outside, a wind whips across the frozen fjord. Inside, though things are surprisingly snug. Viking bedtime wasn't the brutal, sleepless ordeal you might imagine from a warrior culture. In fact, bedtime in a Norse household was a sacred pause, a time of warmth, quiet conversation, and meticulous routine. Not all Vikings were warriors. Most were farmers, weavers, blacksmiths, and shipbuilders, and when the day's labor was done, the house had a rhythm all its own. The longhouse was the center of it all. Imagine it now, a single room stretching long and narrow, the timber walls dark from soot and time. Along both sides, benches served as beds, often lined with furs or straw mats, and sometimes insulated with thick woolen blankets. A central hearth flickered gently, smoke escaping through a small vent in the roof, bathing the rafters in a soft haze. Family members slept shoulder to shoulder, not out of affection necessarily, but practicality. Body heat was a precious commodity. Children nestled between parents, older relatives often stationed near the warmer hearthside, while young men or workers took their places toward the colder ends. Before sleeping, stories were shared, sagas, recited softly from memory. The cadence of an elder's voice, repeating the tale of Odin's sacrifice or Thor's mischief, lulled children into sleep. The spoken word was more than entertainment. It was inheritance. The ability to memorize and retell was a skill passed down with reverence. By modern standards, bedding was rustic. A Viking bed might be nothing more than a wooden frame filled with hay and covered in sheep pelts. But the layers were intentional. Sheep's wool for insulation, sealskin for waterproofing. In the harsh Nordic winter, warmth was survival, and everything from bed construction to sleepwear was designed with care. Sleep, for Vikings, often came in 2 stages. This was the first sleep and second sleep, a pattern now recognized by historians as common across pre-industrial societies. After the first few hours, one would often wake naturally in the middle of the night, perhaps to tend the fire, check the livestock, or even say prayers before lying back down for a second slumber. This Bephossic pattern was as ordinary then as 8 hours straight is now. Lighting played a subtle but important role. Oil lamps made from soapstone or ceramics glowed dimly on wall niches, fed by fish oil or animal fat. The flame danced low and steady, barely enough to light the room, but enough to mark time's passing and comfort the eyes. Clothing for sleep was also particular. Contrary to Hollywood's armored night-sleeping Vikings, most wore long tunics or linen undershirts to bed. Some even used woolen caps or mittens during the deepest winter nights. And socks, always socks. And so you can imagine the end of a day in this Viking world. The coals dim in the hearth. The murmur of storytelling fades. Someone coughs. A child kicks off their fur covering. Wind moans through the roof beams. But inside there is stillness. The house sleep here was not just rest. It was ritual, it was warmth. It was woven into the fabric of survival. But what exactly did the Vikings dream about, nestled under sealskins, with the sagas still echoing in their heads? So, you've settled in for the night, on a bench lined with straw and sheep pelts, your cloak folded under your head. The fire is reduced to glowing coals, and the heavy quiet of the Norse countryside wraps itself around the longhouse like a woolen shroud, But while your body lies still, your mind, if you were a Viking, might be quite busy. To the Norse people, dreams were not random or meaningless. Sleep was not just a passive state, it was a gateway, a vulnerable time when the human soul might wander, visit the dead, encounter the gods, or receive messages from the unseen world. The Vikings didn't just have dreams. They believed dreams meant something. Let's begin with the idea of huga, a concept from Old Norse that doesn't quite translate directly into English. It refers to a person's mind, will, or soul, something that could act independently of the body. During sleep, a person's huga might travel. You, the sleeper, might journey in your dreams to other places, sometimes even appearing in the dreams of others. A kind of spiritual guest, or in some cases, a warning. In fact, dream-sharing stories were not uncommon in Norse sagas. A man might say he dreamt of his brother who had died far away, only to learn the next day that the brother had indeed passed in the night. Coincidence? To the Vikings, it was a sign. Sleep opened a door through which the spirit could pass. This belief created an interesting relationship with sleep. It wasn't just a time for rest. It was an opportunity for guidance, for visions, for omens. In some sagas, kings and warriors would take their dreams very seriously. The saga of the Inglings, for example, tells us of King Vanlandi, who was murdered in his sleep by a mare, a supernatural being, sent by sorcery, who sat on his chest and crushed him. This figure, the Mara, is the root of our word nightmare. According to folklore, she was a spirit or troll who would torment sleepers by riding them like beasts, causing a sensation of being pinned down or choked. Sleep paralysis, yes, but wrapped in myth and fear. As a result, protections against harmful dreams became part of nightly rituals. Charms might be carved into bedposts, runes of protection etched onto walls. Herbal pouches were sometimes placed under pillows filled with mugwort, juniper, or angelica. These weren't just to smell nice. They were believed to keep bad spirits at bay. Children were often told bedtime stories that doubled as spiritual warnings. Don't sleep with your head pointed toward the forest, or the Vitya nature spirits might enter your dreams. Keep an iron nail near the fire. Spirits don't like iron. These simple customs became habits passed down through generations. But dreams weren't always frightening. In fact, some were celebrated. A man who dreamt of Odin or Freya might wake the next day with a new sense of confidence, as if touched by divine approval. In sagas, dreams often predicted success, treasure, or new journeys. Sometimes a character would act based entirely on what he dreamt the night before. It wasn't uncommon for a Viking family to discuss their dreams together in the morning, as you might talk about the weather or last night's stew. Did you see anything? They might ask. Did anyone visit you? Even the way they slept was designed around this spiritual vulnerability. The eldest member of the household might sleep closest to the hearth, not just for warmth, but as a symbolic protector, a watcher of dreams. Some buried ancestors beneath the longhouse floors to keep watch from below. It's also worth noting that many Viking beds, those for wealthier families, were carved with figures of gods and beasts, not merely for decoration. A dragon carved at the bed's head might protect against evil spirits. A wolf to devour nightmares. Sleep was not a place of silence, but of unseen conflict and guidance, both sacred and strange. And yet, despite all this mystical framework, the act of sleeping itself was often just cozy. You can picture it. woolen cloaks bundled, a dog curled near your feet, the creak of old timber and the soft breath of your family rising and falling. These were people who believed the night was both restful and revelatory. Still, one can wonder, with so much emphasis on sleep, dreams, and wandering spirits, what happened if a person never woke up? What did the Vikings believe came after that final sleep? As the final embers of the hearth dim and the night settles into its coldest, quietest hours, we turn now to a different kind of sleep, the one the Vikings could not wake from. In Viking belief, death was not an end so much as a departure. Like sleep, it took the body to another place, only this time the hugr, the soul, would not return. But the connection between nightly sleep and the eternal kind was not lost on them. In many ways, the preparation for burial mirrored the preparations for rest. You were dressed, laid in a familiar position, surrounded by comfort, sometimes even on a literal bed. Let's start with the grave goods. These were not just offerings or tokens of wealth. They were functional items: a woolen cloak, a knife, a comb, items that one might need in the next life, just as one needed them before bed. Some burials even included bedding, blankets, feather pillows, or thick animal pelts. If you were someone important, perhaps you were buried in your own ship, curled into the hull as if tucked under the covers of a familiar vessel, ready to sail into the beyond. There are documented graves where people, especially women, were buried on actual beds. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, for example, 2 women were laid to rest on ornate wooden beds, complete with feather-stuffed bedding. Not just symbolic gestures, but practical ones. If death was a journey, then the Vikings meant for their dead to travel in comfort, and the dreams didn't stop just because someone had died. Many Norse sagas describe the dead returning in dreams, often to deliver warnings or advice. A restless dead person might trouble the living until their body was properly honored or their grave goods rightly arranged. In one tale, a farmer dreams repeatedly of a neighbor he had wronged. The dead man says nothing, simply stares. Night after night. Eventually, the farmer gives a gift to the dead man's kin. The dreams stop. To the Viking mind. The line between sleeping and dying was thin and often walked upon. So what happened after that final sleep? Where did the soul go? There were many answers, depending on your life and how you died. If you were a warrior and died bravely in battle, Odin might send his Valkyries to collect you for Valhalla, a vast echoing hall filled with mead, sword, practice, and endless feasting. It sounds exhausting, but the Norse believed it to be an honor, and curiously, even their rest was part of the routine. You could eat, fight, sleep, and repeat forever. A kind of eternal longhouse, with better ale and fewer chores. But not everyone went to Valhalla. Many went to Helheim, a misty realm ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. It was not a place of torment or punishment, just ... quiet, cold. Still, if Valhalla was a warrior's party, Helheim was more like a communal nap in a foggy forest. The dead slept there, peacefully or not, depending on their lives. It wasn't feared necessarily, just inevitable. Then there were more mysterious destinations, Fanga ruled by Freya, where some warriors also went, or Rand Esnet, for those who drowned at sea and were caught by the sea goddess. These afterlives were not moral judgments. You didn't go to Helheim because you were bad. You went because that's where your thread was spun. Interestingly, while Viking men often longed for Valhalla, Many Viking women were more associated with household spirits, ancestor worship, and quiet legacy. Their afterlife, while less flashy, was no less important. A respected matriarch might be remembered in stories for generations, her dreams living on in the minds of her descendants. The final sleep, for her, might be under the floorboards of her family's home, still watching, still protecting. As Christianity slowly spread into the Norse world in later centuries, these beliefs began to change. The idea of heaven and hell entered the picture, and the old stories started blending with new ones. Still, even Christian Vikings often continued to place pillows and combs and cloaks in graves, just in case. So here we are, from the soft animal pelts of a chieftain's longhouse, to the quiet straw bedding of a fisherman's hut, and finally, to the carved wooden bed of a burial mound. Sleep was always a part of Viking life, and death, it was warm, it was sacred, it was full of mystery. And as the fire goes out for the last time, we're left to wonder if your dreams truly do reflect your soul. What kind of sleep would you find in the halls of the afterlife? Why Roman apartment buildings were surprisingly flammable and cold. Section 1. The insulae. Rome's fire-prone, chilly housing crisis. When we picture ancient Rome, our minds often drift toward gleaming marble temples, grand colosseums echoing with cheers, and the serene luxury of villa gardens. But behind the splendor, in the noisy, cluttered heart of the city, most Romans lived in cramped, precarious buildings called insulae, the ancient world's answer to apartment complexes, and they were less than ideal, built skyward, packed with tenants, and often made from wood, mud, bricks, and a dangerous disregard for safety. These towering structures had a bad habit of burning down and freezing their residents in winter. Yes, somehow they managed to be both too hot and too cold. Let's take a closer, slower look at the very real, very uncomfortable world of Roman insulae, where the walls were thin, the stairs were steep, and a single oil lamp could bring down the whole block. Rome's growing housing problem by the 1st century BCE. Rome was exploding with people, not literally, that came later with volcanoes, but demographically. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the capital from across the empire. Slaves, merchants, artisans, freedmen, and laborers, all looking for work, shelter, and maybe a little olive oil. But land was limited. The wealthy elite could afford sprawling domos homes with inner courtyards and atriums. The rest, they were squeezed into insulae multi-story buildings, crammed into every spare corner of the city. The word insula literally means island, which is appropriate. These buildings stood like islands in a sea of narrow, winding streets, isolated, overpopulated, and frequently sinking under their own weight. At first glance, they weren't entirely awful. Some had shops on the ground floor, and the lower levels could be relatively sturdy and even had running water. But the further up you went, the more things started to wobble. Why they kept catching fire here's where things get a little alarming and a bit smoky. Roman insulae were often constructed quickly and cheaply by speculative developers looking to profit from Rome's housing boom. While the first floor might be made of brick or stone, the upper stories were frequently built from wood, plaster, or rubble held together with weak mortar. A small cooking fire, a knocked-over oil lamp, or an overheated brazier could ignite a deadly blaze. The famous Roman writer Seneca, who lived above a public bath, once complained of the constant noise and fire hazards. "The walls are thin," he grumbled, "and the air is thick with smoke and shouting." He wasn't exaggerating. Rome saw multiple massive fires throughout its history. The most infamous occurred in 64 CE during Nero's reign. This fire burned for over 6 days, destroying much of the city, including entire districts filled with insulae. According to historians like Tacitus, the fire spread easily because of narrow alleys, flammable materials, and the sheer density of buildings. Once one insula went up, the flames leaped from rooftop to rooftop, creating a terrifying domino effect of destruction. Worse still, many buildings didn't have proper fire exits, and residents on higher floors were trapped. Emergency services, if you could call them that, were primitive. Fire brigades existed, but they were sometimes more interested in looting than saving lives. It was, quite literally, a disaster waiting to happen. And why they were freezing cold, but the flames weren't the only enemy. Paradoxically, these buildings were also bitterly cold in winter. That's because higher floors, while cheaper to rent, were completely exposed to the elements. With little insulation and thin walls, tenants on the upper levels suffered through harsh winters with no heating, unless they risked lighting a brazier or fire potsy above fires. These upper rooms were often just one small dimly lit space shared by families, laborers, or students. Imagine a clay floor, drafty wooden shutters, and not much else. Blankets, rare, central heating. Not a chance. To make matters worse, Roman landlords often neglected repairs. According to the Roman satirist Juvenal, only the poor live in the sky. He meant the top floors, the furthest from safety, warmth, and water. Some tenants reportedly used public bathhouses to stay warm, lingering there during the day before returning to their cold, damp homes at night. The daily struggle of insular life. Living in an insula meant adapting to a life of constant caution, carrying water. You had to walk down several flights to the ground-level fountain, and then back up with heavy clay jugs, carefully because stairs were steep, uneven, and often collapsing. Cooking done sparingly, if at all. Many relied on food vendors or communal cooking areas because open flames were so dangerous. Privacy minimal. The walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors snoring, arguing, or other things, and if you were unlucky enough to rent a room near the taverna downstairs, your nights were filled with clinking cups, shouting gamblers, and the smell of fermented fish sauce. Some people opted to sleep on the roof in summer, just to escape the heat and smell, though this came with the added risk of rolling off in the night or being robbed. Regulations, reforms, and the limits of law. Eventually, Roman authorities realized they had a problem. Under Emperor Augustus, building height was limited to 70 Roman feet, about 20 meters. Later, Emperor Nero reduced that to 60 feet, trying to curb the vertical chaos. Firefighting brigades called the Vigils were organized, a mix of firemen and night watchmen. But enforcement was lax. Bribes were common, corners were cut, and slumlords continued stacking people higher and higher. One historian, Strabo, noted that these buildings rise to a height equal to the city walls. A striking and terrifying visual, considering those walls were built to withstand sieges, not accommodate sleeping bakers and tailors. Even Emperor Hadrian, known for his architectural passion, couldn't fully tame the chaos of Rome's private housing market. The insulae remained haphazard, fragile, and filled to the brim with ordinary Romans just trying to get by. So here we have it, the everyday backdrop of ancient urban life. Not temples, not palaces, but rickety, flammable, drafty buildings, leaning into each other like tired shoulders in a crowd. Most Romans lived in these spaces, laughed, argued, loved, and died in them. These weren't just buildings, they were silent witnesses to history, teetering at the edge of collapse, yet always full of life. Next time you admire a Roman aqueduct or arena, spare a thought for the tenement dwellers who had to carry their water up for stories, in the rain, hoping the staircase held firm. And maybe ask yourself, would you rather freeze or risk fire? We've explored the daily discomforts of living in an ancient Roman insula, the danger of fire, the bite of winter drafts, and the awkward closeness of too many lives packed too high. But while ancient writers like Juvenal and Seneca gave us vivid, often grumpy, word pictures of these buildings, modern archaeologists have done something even more astonishing. They've found the ruins, and what they've discovered, hiding beneath layers of ash, bricks, and collapsed staircases, has filled in the quiet, cold corners of Roman life in ways no epic poem ever could. The insulae of Ostia, Rome's forgotten suburb to find the best preserved remains of Roman apartment buildings. You don't actually go to Rome, you head a little southwest, to a quiet, dusty place called Astia Antica, once a bustling port city at the mouth of the Tiber River. Astia was essentially Rome's commercial twin, filled with warehouses, taverns, bathhouses, ... and lots of inns, ULAE. Unlike central Rome, much of Ostia was gradually abandoned, not built over. This allowed archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries to uncover entire blocks of ancient apartment buildings, still standing, some up to 4 stories tall. And while time has worn away the wooden floors and roofs, the brick walls, stairwells, and even latrines remain. What we learn from Ostia isn't just how the buildings were constructed, but how people lived. A peek inside the ancient tenement. One famous example is the Insula of Diana, named after a fresco of the goddess found inside. It's not just one building, but a kind of ancient Roman walk-up complex, complete with shops at street level, selling bread, wine, and olives. Communal courtyards where residents could gather, fill water jars, or catch a bit of sun. Steep staircases which grew narrower and rougher the higher you went. Tiny rooms on the upper floors, some less than 10 square meters, just over 100 square feet. Inside, archaeologists have found blackened walls, possibly from oil lamp, smoke, or earlier fires. Charred remnants of wooden beams, reminders of how often these places burned. Simple pottery, broken jars, and bits of bronze keys. One apartment had a cooking niche, barely large enough for a small firepot, suggesting meals were quick, smoky affairs. Another had traces of mosaics, hinting that even poor tenants sometimes decorated their homes with care. The walls, once plastered and painted, were scrawled with graffiti names, prayers, sometimes vulgar jokes. It's in these scratches that we hear the whispered voices of people long gone. Plumbing, privacy, and pigeon problems. So what did daily comfort look like in these insulates? Let's start with plumbing. If you were lucky enough to live on the lower floors, you might have access to running water via lead pipes from a public fountain or aqueduct. But those on the upper floors, water had to be carried up manually, every single day. Toilets, too, were mostly shared. Some insulae had communal latrines, but many relied on chamber pots. In cities like Rome, where garbage collection was spotty and civic infrastructure strained, this meant that some residents simply emptied waste out the window, a custom that led to laws about shouting cave, "Watch out," before tossing anything. As for animals, pigeons and mice were common companions. They lived in the eaves, nested between cracked tiles, and sometimes even ended up in cooking pots when food was scarce. The quiet realities of tenant life. From rent records and legal tablets, we know that apartments were rented by a variety of people: talkers, weavers, barbers, even teachers. Rent was higher on the lower floors, where it was safer, warmer, and easier to fetch water. Upper floors, called canacular, were cheaper, but often less stable, colder and darker. Tenants signed short-term leases, sometimes month to month. Due to the instability, literal and financial, of the buildings, some apartments were shared between unrelated roommates. Others housed entire extended families in a single room. In one record, we find a tenant named Lucius the Fuller, who paid to rent a third-story flat near a dye shop. Another mentions a Gaius, a freedman and potter, who shared an insular unit with his apprentice and cousin. These were the invisible middle class and working poor of Rome. They left few statues or monuments, but they shaped the daily rhythm of the empire. Rome's struggles with fire safety after the Great Fire of 64 CE. Emperor Nero attempted a massive urban reform. Buildings were to be spaced farther apart, made with non-flammable materials, and required to have fire-break walls. But implementation was another story. While Ostia's insulae were made primarily of brick, many in Rome continued to cut corners. Fires remained frequent to help control them. The city had the Vigils Urbani, Rome's firefighting force of about 7,000 men, but their equipment was limited: buckets, axes, and pumps. They formed bucket brigades and even used blankets soaked in vinegar to smother flames. Still, firefighting was reactive, not preventive. Poorly constructed buildings, reckless cooking, and cramped conditions made the vigil's job nearly impossible. In some cases, developers actually welcomed fires, using them as an excuse to rebuild and raise rents. It's an unsettling reminder that disaster has always had profiteers. Cold comforts. Surviving the winters in Rome weren't Arctic, but they could be miserable, especially for those on the top floors of an insula. Wind howled through unsealed shutters. Moisture seeped in from leaky roofs. Without proper heating, residents relied on layers of tunics, shared body warmth, and, if lucky, woolen blankets. The wealthier classes had hypocaust systems, early underfloor heating in their villas. Insular dwellers had small braziers, but lighting them was risky. Fires for warmth could, and did, cause deadly blazes. Many tenants avoided them altogether, choosing to simply suffer through the cold. Or they left home altogether to spend evenings in public bathhouses, lingering in the hot rooms, calderia, before going back to their freezing beds. What survives? Wills, leases, and little details aside from physical ruins. What survives from insular life? Lease tablets, written on wax or stone, show rental agreements, disputes, and eviction notices. Graffiti preserved in places like Pompeii gives us glimpses into humor, frustration, and daily rituals. Legal codes from emperors like Justinian reference. Insular laws, rules about repairs, disputes between tenants, even limits on building height. In one case, a Roman landlord was sued for not fixing a staircase that collapsed and injured two tenants. Another decree required landlords to provide safe egress routes, likely ignored, given how many people died in later fires. These little records, mundane as they may seem, are precious. They show the bureaucratic heartbeat behind the empire, not battles, not triumphs, but leases, repairs, and safety inspections. What modern cities can learn, it's tempting to dismiss insulae as ancient relics of a bygone age. But in truth, they echo modern concerns. Urban overcrowding and safe housing conditions inequality between renters and landlords, fire hazards in poorly regulated buildings. Sound familiar? In cities around the world today, from New York to Dhaka, tenants still live in buildings that are too high, too fragile, or too neglected. Fires still break out in slums and low-income housing, and winter cold still seeps through badly insulated walls. The Roman insula, in all its fire-prone drafty discomfort, is a mirror of today, a reminder that even as architecture evolves, the challenges of human housing often remain the same. So next time you hear the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," remember, many of those roads led to cold, crowded, and combustible tenements, filled with lives that mattered, even if they never made it into marble. And as we walk among the ruins of Ostia or brush soot from a charred wall in Pompeii, we ask what other forgotten stories still wait, buried under ash and silence. The end of the insular collapse, decline, and a city's fading skyline. The Roman insula was never meant to last, built quickly, stacked high and patched endlessly. These ancient apartment buildings rose with the ambition of empire but often crumbled under their own weight. Fires, collapses, and economic shifts would eventually turn many of these homes into ashes and rubble. But the story doesn't end there. As the centuries rolled on and Rome itself began to transform, so too did its skyline. The fall of the insula was not just architectural, it was symbolic. A visual representation of a world both shrinking and slipping away. Collapse, when Rome started falling from the inside by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. The Roman Empire was feeling the cracks. Political instability, plagues, and economic downturns all took their toll. And one of the most visible signs of that slow decline was the urban housing crisis. The towering insulae, which had once loomed over every Roman street, began falling into disrepair. The money wasn't there to rebuild after fires. Landlords, many of them absentee elites, simply abandoned properties. In some cases, upper floors were deliberately dismantled to reduce weight and fire risk. In fact, by the time Emperor Constantine moved the capital east to Byzantium, later Constantinople in the 4th century, Rome's population had already shrunk dramatically. Fewer people meant fewer tenants, and fewer tenants meant fewer repairs. Soon, entire districts that once buzzed with apartment life became ghostly, burned-out skeletons of brick and stone, from insula to ruin. When buildings became quarries in medieval Rome, long after the empire's fall, many of the surviving insula weren't respected as relics. They were mined. That's right, mined for materials. Brick was repurposed to build churches, homes, and fortresses. Marble from ruined staircases and columns was carted off to make altars and palaces. Even lead piping, long buried in walls, was dug out and melted down. The once towering apartment blocks slowly vanished, not from catastrophe, but from scavenging. Roman ruins became Rome's building supply store. Even today, when you see a medieval bell tower or Renaissance villa, chances are some of its stones were once part of an insula. What replaced the insula? After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Rome didn't exactly start over, it shrank inward. Population estimates suggest that by the 7th century, Rome may have housed as few as 20,000 people, compared to over 1 million in its imperial prime. In this smaller or quieter city, villas and palaces became more common than multi-story apartments. Monasteries and churches took over old neighborhoods. Families lived in walled compounds or ground-level houses, no longer stacked skyward. With fewer people and less pressure on land, there was no longer a need for tenement towers. The city flattened both in height and in energy. Byzantine echoes and the rise of other cities, interestingly, while Rome's insulae faded into memory. The idea of apartment-style living didn't disappear in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Byzantium cities, like Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria, continued building multi-level homes, often in more organized and fire-safe ways. Some scholars argue that Byzantine builders learned from Rome's mistakes, using sturdier materials and enforcing better regulations. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, vertical living evolved independently. In China, multi-story homes called yaodongs and tower houses flourished. In Yemen, ancient cities like Shibam built high-rise mud brick buildings, some up to 11 stories, tall, earning it the nickname the Manhattan of the desert. Rome had not invented the high-rise, and it certainly wouldn't be the last to lose them. Nightfall in the Eternal City back in Rome. The end of the insula marked more than just the fall of a building style. It was the slow dimming of an entire urban way of life. The streets grew quieter, the public fountains trickled less frequently, and the sound of footsteps on upper staircases faded into silence. As centuries passed, people began to forget what insulae were even for. The ruins became mysterious. Medieval travelers walked through broken arches and speculated that they were once temples or palaces. It wasn't until Renaissance antiquarians and later archaeologists began excavating places like Ostia and Pompeii that the truth came back into focus. These weren't grand halls or sacred spaces. They were homes. Homes of tailors and bakers, potters and porters. Places where oil lamps flickered at dinner and where families huddled against winter winds. Buildings full of love, work, noise, mess, and occasional disaster. A few surprising survivals even today. Fragments of the insular age remain in Rome, if you know where to look. At Via di Tor Margana, a section of a 2nd century CE insular wall still stands, sandwiched between modern buildings, near the Capitoline Hill, beneath layers of medieval stone. Archaeologists have uncovered cellar-level remnants of insular foundations, and in the Palatine Museum you can see the charred remains of insular staircases, still blackened from ancient fires, preserved in eerie stillness. They're easy to miss, but if you pause and listen closely, you might just hear the creak of footsteps and the distant call of a vendor down the alley. What the insulae left behind. So what do we make of these strange, fire-prone, crowded buildings that once housed the greatest empire on earth? Maybe this, the insula, reminds us that history isn't just emperors and armies. It's also about rent, leaky ceilings, cold floors, and neighbors who stomped too loudly upstairs. It's about people doing the best they could with the homes they had, even when those homes leaned a little too far to one side. It's also a warning. Modern cities, for all their steel and safety codes, still struggle with housing that puts profit over people. And as we build our own high-rises, maybe we should remember those forgotten tenants of ancient Rome, hauling water up for flights of stairs, hoping the brazier didn't spark the next time your radiator rattles or the power goes out in winter. Take comfort in knowing you're not alone. Somewhere in time, a Roman named Gaius cursed his drafty top floor flat, too. How ancient Egyptian farmers scheduled their lives around the Nile's burp section. 1. The river that ruled the clock. You are lying somewhere warm. The air is still, and in the distance, you hear a soft ripple of water, familiar, ancient, rhythmic. It's the Nile, not the bustling river of Cleopatra's tales or the dramatic stage for Moses' flight, but the quiet, consistent, almost boring pulse of daily life in ancient Egypt. Imagine you are an Egyptian farmer in the year 1600 BCE. Your feet press into the thick, damp silt of a riverbank. The sun is already rising, hazy gold spreading across the endless brown fields and slow-moving waters. You aren't concerned with hours or minutes. There are no clocks here. Your calendar doesn't hang on a wall. Instead, it arrives with a sound, a scent, and a swell. The Nile burps. The burp, of course, isn't an actual belch. It's the gentle but profound gurgling up of flood waters that the Egyptians simply called a kit, the inundation. Each year, almost like clockwork, the Nile would overflow its banks during the summer, drenching the lowlands in a thick, black mud the Egyptians worshipped as sacred. This wasn't a flood to fear, it was a flood to plan a life around. The ancient Egyptians didn't have irrigation systems like the Romans or the terraced rice paddies of China. They didn't need them. The river did all the work. Each year, the water would rise, cover the fields, deposit nutrient, silt, and then recede, leaving behind land ready for planting. It was agriculture by divine appointment. The entire Egyptian calendar revolved around this cycle. Their year was divided into 3 seasons: Akit, the flooding; Pere, the growing; and Shemu, the harvest. There was no need for months named after emperors or lunar cycles. The Nile was the calendar, the clock, and the boss. And so, the average farmer didn't consult an oracle or a sundial. He watched the water. When the river started to swell, preparations began. Tools were sharpened. Oxen were readied. But there was no rush. Farming in ancient Egypt was a slow, ceremonial process. It was, in many ways, about waiting. The waiting, though, was far from idle. During Akit, when the fields were too waterlogged to work, farmers were drafted for national service. The pharaoh didn't want anyone lounging around. Many were sent to help build temples, haul stone for monuments, or repair canal walls. The idea of a long, lazy vacation wasn't part of the rhythm. If the Nile gave you a pause from farming, the state gave you a shovel. Yet this state labor wasn't always drudgery. For many Egyptians, it was an honor to contribute to projects that served the gods and the afterlife. There's evidence that during these flood months, entire communities traveled to work on massive constructions, their wages paid in beer, bread, and the rare occasion of meat. And in the evenings, these labor camps could be surprisingly festive, complete with music, dancing, and games involving throwing sticks or rolling hoops. But back home, back by the riverbanks, everything was about watching. The arrival of the flood was so important that priests in temples maintained Nilometer stone, gauges carved into steps or walls that measured the water's rise. Too low, a flood meant famine. Too high meant destruction. But just right, a Goldilocks flood meant a good year, generous gods, and plenty of beer. So much importance was placed on predicting the flood that the appearance of the star Sirius, known as Sopdat to the Egyptians, became the celestial herald of the inundation. Its rising just before dawn in midsummer perfectly matched the swelling of the Nile. To the Egyptian farmer, it wasn't just a star, it was a cosmic clock. But this celestial alignment wasn't eternal. Over centuries, due to the Earth's wobble, on its axis a gentle tilt called precession Sirius's timing began to shift. The farmers wouldn't have noticed at first, of course. A few days' difference meant nothing when your whole life was organized by mud. But temple priests, those who kept the nilameters and the star charts, they noticed. They would add corrections, adjust festivals, recalibrate rituals, not out of superstition, but out of practical necessity. If the Nile was the god, then their job was to keep the god's schedule running smoothly. And so, for over 3,000 years, the rhythm of life pulsed gently alongside the river. A child born in Akit would harvest their first crop in Shimu 18 years later. Entire families traced their fortunes to the water's generosity. The burp of the Nile wasn't a disaster, it was a promise. Yet even within this dependability, questions lingered. Why did the river flood at all? Where did this mysterious water come from? For the Egyptian farmer, who rarely traveled more than a few miles from home, the headwaters of the Nile were a distant myth. Many believed it to be the tears of Isis, mourning her slain husband Osiris. Others thought it came from the underworld, itself a gift from beyond. We now know, of course, that the Nile's floods were caused by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands. But that explanation would have seemed impossibly dull to the average Egyptian. The river burped because the gods were pleased, perhaps displeased, depending on the year. So here you are, waiting once more. You have your seed stored in clay jars, your plough is polished, your oxen munch lazily under a reed awning. The water creeps higher, warm and slow. You light a lamp. The air smells like damp straw and river muck, and you wait. Because when the Nile speaks, you listen. But what if, one year, the Nile said nothing? The year the Nile was silent, you wake to silence. Not the absence of sound, there's the usual chorus of ibis and frogs, the gentle hum of village life, but the river has not arrived. The air hangs heavy with dust, not mist. The flood is late in. Most years, by mid-July, the Nile would have already begun its gentle rise, swelling like a breath drawn in before a long chant. But this year, the Nilometers remain stubbornly dry, their carved steps caked in yesterday's dust. The village priest frowns more often now. Elders begin muttering over morning bread. The earth beneath your toes feels too warm, too cracked. Something is wrong. The ancient Egyptian farmer, like you, was not one to panic quickly. After all, the Nile was dependably always burped eventually. But you, like others in your village, remember the stories your grandfather once told. You of the year of the thin flood, when the waters barely wet the fields and hunger crept in by spring. His face tightened even in memory. That year, and others like it, left a mark not only on families, but on national stability. A single failed flood could spell disaster. 2 failed floods could trigger famine, rebellion, and collapse. The Nile gave Egypt its bounty, but it also gave it its fragility. The measurement of misery priests across the land descend their Nilometers with quiet urgency. These were not simply spiritual figures, they were, in many ways, bureaucrats. Data they gathered, literally etched into stone, was crucial for determining everything from taxes to ritual calendars. If the water didn't reach a certain mark, farmers were taxed less. If it flooded too high, fields were ruined and remissions were offered. Pharaohs were judged, in part, by the performance of the river during their reigns. You, of course, aren't thinking about taxes, you're thinking about your wheat. Without the flood, the black silt doesn't come. And without the silt, the dry, exhausted soil of Egypt can't grow anything. There's no plan B. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians did eventually create basic irrigation systems, canals, basins, dikes, but these weren't enough to replace a full inundation. They merely helped extend the reach of a modest flood or drain fields that flooded too high. They could not conjure fertility from dust. The state responds in times of failed floods. The pharaoh's court would respond, often with relief measures, grain from state granaries, the temporary reduction of corvée labor or distribution of beer, and barley in temples. Temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were storage facilities, economic hubs, and disaster relief centers. Yet not everyone received help. Far-off villagers, lower caste farmers, and herders often suffered most. As harvests failed, bread prices soared. A farmer might sell a cow for a sack of grain or worse. Sell their tools, their land, even their children. You've heard these rumors from the southern provinces. A man from Aswan passed through recently, begging for grain. He said they had slaughtered their goats weeks ago. His eyes were too wide, too sunken. God's on trial as the flood delays stretch into weeks. The religious implications begin to weigh. The Nile was more than water. It was divine blood, the tears of Isis, the semen of Hopi, the laughter of Osiris. A failed flood meant a breakdown in this sacred relationship. Temples offered more elaborate rituals, burning rare incense, sacrificing fattened oxen, and singing longer prayers to Hopi. The priests of Thebes and Memphis debated in low voices. It the people's sin, the pharaoh's failing, or a cosmic imbalance. Sometimes, when desperation grew, lesser-known deities surged in popularity. In times of drought, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, was invoked with trembling hands. The crocodile god, Sobek, to protector of water and fertility, received new temples in troubled times. These spiritual shifts echoed real fears. When the river changed, the gods changed with it. Adapting daily life, Hugh began rationing. Breakfast is thinner, lunch later, dinner skipped. You've begun mixing chaff into the flour to stretch it. Your neighbor digs a deeper well. Though he finds little, the oxen grow leaner. At night, you try not to think of next month. Some families abandon their land entirely, heading for cities like Memphis or Thebes. Urban temples and granaries can sometimes offer more reliable food, but that journey is perilous, and city guards are known to turn away the starving. Others find new ways to cope. Some farmers begin practicing water-conserving techniques, planting drought-resistant vegetables like lentils, using small-scale basin irrigation, or drying and storing seeds for future seasons. These adaptations, while not enough to overcome famine, speak to the resilience of ancient Egyptians. Still, rumors persist of canal walls crumbling, of villages along the delta forced into migration, of laborers turning to banditry on trade roads. You tighten the ropes on your grain jars. You sleep with your sickle beside you now. And then, finally, one day it comes, a trickle, a shimmer, a scent on the wind. The priests announce it first, but you've already seen it from your rooftop. The Nile has begun to rise, a full month. Late and thinner than usual, but unmistakable. The black water glistens under the morning sun. Neighbors gather at the edge of the fields. Some cheer, others weep, most simply watch in exhausted silence. The river, your river, has returned. But the questions remain. Will it be enough? Can a late, low flood still save the season? What will the yield look like? And what if, next year, it doesn't return at all? Feast, famine, and the Pharaoh's reckoning, the Nile has returned. But not like before. In most years, the flood swelled with proud confidence, spilling, soaking the parched banks, leaving behind a thick black silt as it receded. This year, it comes hesitantly. The waters creep into the fields, but they do not roar. You can walk knee-deep in the shallows where last year the current would have swept. You away the priests still declare it a blessing. They say Hopi has answered your prayers, that the Pharaoh's offering was accepted, that order matters restored. But you can see the truth in the soil. The silt layer is thin, patchy in places. You scratch the earth with a wooden spade. It crumbles. It will not be a strong year. Yet even a poor flood is better than none. The clock resumes with the waters finally flowing. The agricultural calendar groans back into motion. For months, life had been frozen in an anxious pause. Now, a flurry of activity returns. First come the basin openings. Ancient Egyptian farmers, like yourself, divert the slow-moving Nile into a network of small, sunken plots. These basins are carved by hand, guided by centuries of local knowledge and communal effort. You work shoulder to shoulder with neighbors to break open the mud embankments, letting the river pool gently across your fields. For 2 months, the land drinks deeply. Next comes Peretha, growing season. As the water recedes, you and your family sow seeds quickly into the wet earth. Wheat, barley, flax, lentils and chickpeas where there's less water. You hope it's enough. With fewer oxen, weaker soil, and dwindling seed stock. You know the harvest won't be generous. Still, there's movement, purpose. The worst may be over. When records become warnings elsewhere, scribes begin the work of inscription. The flood's height is etched into the walls of the Nilometers. The Temple of Karnak records the year's Nile level, just as it has for over a millennium. This record-keeping might seem dull, but it served a vital role. Patterns, prophecies, and warnings emerged from these annual measurements. Modern scholars now use these carvings, faded and chipped, to track environmental change over thousands of years. And in your time, a low flood carved into stone might echo into political tension for decades. Too many short floods in a row, and people begin to talk. Whispers stir in the villages. Has the pharaoh angered the gods? Is the vizier hoarding grain? Are the temples hiding something? You don't say these things aloud, but you've heard the murmurings at the granary gates. An old man even compared this year to the infamous famine of Jedkara-Isis's reign, when mothers ate their own children. You pray he's exaggerating. Redistribution and resentment as the harvest nears. So to do the tax collectors. Egypt's centralized government depended on predictable surpluses. In return for the flood's bounty, farmers gave a portion of their grain to the state. This wasn't always paid in coin more. Often it was literal grain, carted in woven baskets and stored in giant granaries run by temples or bureaucrats. But this year, when the taxman arrives, there's a problem. You show him your cracked, narrow stalks, your half-full bins. He frowns, takes out a measuring rod. You argue gently. He marks your home with red paint a note for lower taxation, perhaps, or for increased scrutiny. You're not sure in the cities. Redistribution begins. The state granaries open just a little enough to prevent mass starvation, not enough to satisfy the hungry. Priests frame it as divine generosity, You know it's politics. Still, the breadlines grow longer, crisis and change not. Every bad year brings revolution, but enough of them string together, and even the most godlike pharaoh can find his crown wobbling. Historians now know that periods of prolonged drought, perhaps linked to distant volcanic eruptions or long climate cycles, contributed to the eventual decline of the Old Kingdom. Famines strained local economies, disrupted trade routes, and undermined faith in the monarchy in some cases. Desperate officials tried new tactics: deeper canals, experimental crops, alternate storage systems. Sometimes they turned to scapegoats: migrants, Nubian raiders, or rebellious provinces. In one stele, a pharaoh curses those who steal the god's share, implying that someone, perhaps even a temple, had withheld tribute during the lean years. And then there were the ordinary people like you. Some left their farms and joined temple workforces. Others became boatmen or soldiers, exchanging soil for service. Many simply endured. You do the same. Resilience in ritual. In the quiet evenings, your wife lights a lamp. She hums an old song, a hymn to Hopi. Your daughter arranges clay figurines, crocodiles, and cows along the ledge of your home. You burn a small offering of herbs, not because you expect it to change the flood, but because it's what your ancestors did. This too is part of Egypt's power, ritual as rhythm, a cultural memory stretching back so far that even in famine, there is continuity. And the next flood, who knows? Maybe it will be stronger, maybe it won't come at all. But even now, beneath the uncertainty, life beats onward like the Nile itself, sometimes a torrent, sometimes a trickle, but always there. The lice-picking sessions that passed for Tudor romance. Section 1. Itching for affection in the age of rough collars. You imagine courtship in the Tudor era. Think Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I, and the glorious mess of 16th century England. Probably picture grand banquets, lute playing under moonlit windows, and scandalous glances across velvet-draped halls. But romance, like so many things in history, wasn't all sugar and satin. Sometimes it was itchy, very itchy. In a time before deodorant, shampoo, or even reliable indoor plumbing, affection could look like a tender moment shared over ... lice. Yes, lice. Fleas, nits, and other tiny creatures scurried across the wigs, ruffs, and codpieces of Tudor men and women alike. And rather than recoil from the infestation, lovers sometimes used it as a bonding ritual. Because when you're wearing 15 layers of wool and haven't bathed in a week, intimacy has to come from somewhere. Welcome to the lice-picking session, the surprisingly personal, weirdly romantic ritual that passed for affection in Tudor England. Love and the time of verminets start with the basics. Everyone had lice. The Tudor world, particularly in cities like London, was an ideal breeding ground for parasites. Personal hygiene was primitive by modern standards. Bathing was rare and even discouraged by physicians who feared that warm water opened the pores to disease. Water was often dirty or shared communally, and laundry was infrequent. The result, a booming population of lice, fleas, and bedbugs, to mention the rats that came along with them. Lice weren't just a nuisance. They were a daily reality, part of the human experience. Everyone had them: royalty, clergy, commoners, servants. If you were lucky, you changed your linen once a week. If not, you might go months wearing the same shirt. Linen shirts, by the way, were one of the only barriers between skin and infestation. They were called body linens, and their main purpose was to collect dirt, sweat, and vermin, so outer garments wouldn't get as filthy. In a world where lice were so common, dealing with them became oddly normalized. And for some, it was even intimate, grooming as courtship today. You might hold someone's hand, tuck their hair behind their ear, or share a playlist to show you care. In the Tudor world, you might gently search through your beloved thick head of hair, picking out lice one by one. This wasn't seen as disgusting, was tender. There's historical evidence that this kind of grooming behavior was common between couples, friends, and even nobles and their servants. The act of sitting together, closely inspecting each other's scalps or clothing, was both necessary and comforting. It offered a rare moment of physical closeness in a culture that otherwise discouraged too much touch outside of marriage, and for the Tudors, it was deeply personal. Lice didn't care about class, but grooming did. To pick lice from someone's hair or collar was to care to acknowledge their discomfort and seek to relieve it. In a society obsessed with appearances, where grooming rituals were lengthy and layered, the simple act of helping someone delouse was a quiet, human gesture. In royal courts, noble households, and peasant cottages alike, lice picking was a shared experience, a mundane, repetitive task that became a language of affection. Royalty wasn't exempted, might comfort or horrify you to know that even kings and queens weren't immune. Queen Elizabeth I, famed for her glorious red wigs and heavily powdered face, likely struggled with head lice. Wigs, in fact, became popular partly to hide thinning hair and scalp conditions caused by infestations. Wigs were not cleaned the way we'd expect today. Instead, they were frequently powdered with starch, sometimes mixed with pleasant-smelling herbs, and worn over lice-ridden scalps. Beneath those elaborate hairstyles and jeweled headdresses, there was often a world of crawling, scratching, and discomfort. Courtiers and ladies-in-waiting, tasked with attending to the monarch's appearance, would often be the ones to handle lice. This meant that, even in the presence of power, the parasite problem was ... unavoidable. And while royals may not have sat on benches combing through each other's hair like commoners, there's little doubt that lice were a familiar enemy in every chamber of the Tudor palace. Pillow talk with parasites, bedrooms, specially shared ones, were hubs of lice activity. In households where multiple people slept in the same bed or room, a very common arrangement, lice and fleas spread easily. The heat of bodies under thick wool blankets provided the perfect environment for breeding. Children often picked lice from their siblings. Servants groomed their masters, and lovers, they might lie together, whispering beneath the rushlight, and pause mid-conversation to pluck a nit from an eyebrow or collar. It sounds grotesque now, but in a world without screens, without perfume, without many of the trappings we associate with cleanliness and seduction, these simple acts offering a comb, cleaning a shirt, soothing an itch were genuine tokens of closeness. After all, when someone is willing to touch your lice, that's love. Of course, these moments were not always romantic. Sometimes lice picking was just routine maintenance. Sometimes it was humiliating, especially when done in public or by a servant. And sometimes it was done not out of affection, but out of necessity. But what does it say about Tudor romance that something so small, so mundane, could also be so personal? Itching etiquette, grooming, gossip, and the ritual of closeness in the Tudor world. Etiquette and hygiene did not always align the way we expect them to today. The idea of grooming as an intimate act extended beyond romance and into the fabric of daily life, blurring the lines between public behavior, private rituals, and social status. In this section, we'll delve deeper into how lice picking was woven into broader Tudor customs, the grooming habits of the era, the shared social experience of managing parasites, and the strange overlap between vanity and vermin. Because in Tudor England, what passed for affection was often rooted in practical survival, and the rituals that surrounded it were as complex and telling as any ballroom dance. Grooming tools of the Tudor trade. Though the average Tudor didn't bathe much, they didn't exactly neglect personal grooming either. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Combs were widely used, not just to untangle hair but to catch lice. Special knit combs with very fine teeth were made specifically to remove parasites from the scalp. These were often made from wood, bone, or ivory, depending on one's wealth, and were prized household items. Some were even passed down through generations. Nits the tiny, white, rice-like eggs of lice were difficult to remove. The combing process could take hours and had to be repeated often. This turned grooming into a daily ritual, sometimes done communally, sometimes alone. In noble houses, servants often combed their master's hair in the morning, sometimes in pairs, one combing, one checking. In households where there were no servants, it was up to family or lovers to take up the comb, and so lice picking became less of a chore and more of a shared moment. Some wealthier individuals also used herbal preparations to deter lice. Rosemary, lavender, and pennyroyal might be crushed into oils or powders and applied to the scalp or clothing. But these methods were inconsistent and rarely effective for long. In other words, no matter how rich or poor, nobody got a free pass. Social grooming and gossip. Imagine a scene in a Tudor village. It's late afternoon, and several women are seated on stools outside a timber-framed cottage, sunlight glinting off the brass pins in their coifs. As they mend clothes, shell peas, or spin wool, one of them leans over to inspect another's scalp. A fine-toothed comb appears, and with a matter-of-fact sigh, she begins to work. This was common. Women often helped one another with grooming, not just as a health measure, but as a social activity, while fingers or combs plucked through thick braids. Conversation would flow about childbirth, market prices, the vicar's new sermon, or the girl next door who'd been seen lingering too long by the blacksmith's forge. These lice-picking sessions doubled as gossip circles, where status was reaffirmed and alliances were made. Who picked whose licensed, how gently could say a lot about social bonds. A young girl being groomed by an older woman might be seen as being taken under her wing. A new bride being groomed by her mother-in-law might be enduring the slow process of being accepted into the household. The lice weren't the point. The closeness was. Cleanliness as a moral concern. One reason lice-picking held such power in relationships was the broader Tudor view of cleanliness. Cleanliness wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. Tudor physicians and clergymen often warned against excessive bathing. Water, they believed, opened the pores and allowed in bad humors or diseases. In place of bathing, people changed linens, scrubbed the surface of their skin, and used herbs or perfumes to manage odor. The goal wasn't sterility, was balanced out, and so, being well groomed meant managing the visible signs of infestation and disorder: your hair, your cuffs, your rough snot, eliminating them entirely. A person who took the time to comb lice from their hair was seen as virtuous, even if the lice returned the next day. In romantic relationships, this moral lens added a layer of trust. Letting someone comb your hair was exposing a private, often embarrassing part of yourself. Letting them see your lice and still want to touch you was, in some ways, an act of deep emotional intimacy. It meant they accepted your body, your flaws, your humanity. Love in the light of the hearth during long Tudor winters. Nights were cold, dark, and often shared in close quarters. Whole families might sleep in one bed. In wealthier homes, servants often slept just outside the master's chamber. Privacy was rare, and quiet moments like grooming often became the only true connection between couples by firelight. As shadows flickered on the wall, two people might sit shoulder to shoulder, inspecting collars and hairlines by touch and sight. They might pause to speak softly about the day's events. They might joke or simply sit in silence. The steady scrape of the comb, a kind of lullaby. In this context, grooming became comforting, even calming. It was tactile, rhythmic, and deeply human. Lice were a nuisance, but lice picking, that was care. Written records, quiet moments all, though few personal letters from the lower classes survive. We catch glimpses of these grooming rituals in plays, poems, and medical texts of the period. Shakespeare himself often referenced lice humorously, using them as a metaphor for scandal or sin, but he also alluded to the act of grooming as something close and familiar. In Much Ado About Nothing, there's a subtle nod to pestilent fellows and the need to comb out their influence and image, likely familiar to every audience member. The irony is that while grooming might have been routine, it wasn't meaningless. Each touch, each slow movement of fingers through hair, each knit squished between thumb and nails, these actions carried emotional weight. They were signs of domestic life, of stability, of someone else being there to share the load of daily living, and, in the Tudor world, that meant something. So the next time you think of Tudor romance, don't stop at the velvet and lace. Picture the real, human scenes behind the ruffled collars where affection was expressed, not just in words or gifts, but in the simple, meticulous act of lice-picking. Love, class, and lice, the hidden intimacies of Tudor life. By now, it's clear that lice-picking in Tudor England wasn't merely a matter of hygiene, it was an act loaded with social meaning, emotional trust, and even affection. But in this final section, we'll explore how these quiet grooming rituals were shaped by status, gender, and the pressures of everyday survival. From noble chambers to common cottages, the handling of lice reflected deep inequalities and subtle emotional negotiations. These sessions reveal far more than just who was clean or dirty. They reveal who was cared for, who held power, and who, despite the odds, found small, persistent ways to feel close to one another. In noble houses, grooming and control for the nobility, lice-picking looked different, not necessarily because there were fewer lice, but because of how they were handled. Wealthier Tudors didn't pick their own lice. They had grooming servants, sometimes called valets or ladies' maids, whose job it was to dress them, manage their linens, maintain wigs, and yes, deal with infestations. These acts were considered beneath the gentry, but were nonetheless critical to their comfort and public appearance. But even among the upper classes, certain bonds formed. A noblewoman might trust only one maid to help her with personal hygiene. A favored servant might be praised for having a gentle touch or an attentive eye. In royal courts, a monarch's favorite might rise through the ranks not through war or wit, but by being the one who dressed the king each morning and kept his wardrobe parasite-free. These acts, though silent and seemingly mundane, became a currency of trust, and they could backfire too. Gossip about lice could be weaponized. If word got out that a lady at court was frequently infested, her hygiene and virtue might both be questioned. Thus, the act of grooming was not just personal, it was political. In the villages, a quiet rebellion of affection among commoners. The relationship between lice and love was far more tactile and far less guarded. Young couples might begin their courtship not with a dance, but with shared chores, and grooming was among the most tender of these. A boy might offer to comb a girl's hair after harvest. A girl might jokingly accuse a suitor of looking lacy, just to get closer and touch his scalp without causing scandal. Married couples, too, found that time spent grooming one another, especially during the dark winter months, was among the few quiet moments they had together. Children would often fall asleep beside them, listening to the scrape of the comb or the soft sound of laughter. In this way, lice-picking became a rhythm of life, a daily act of comfort wrapped in necessity. This was especially true for older couples. One 17th century diary, written by a country midwife, mentions how her husband still asked her to comb his beard for creatures every Sunday after dinner, even after 40 years of marriage. She noted it without romance, but with warmth. These actions were, in their own way, small acts of rebellion. In a world full of labor, cold, and disease, finding closeness in such humble routines was a reminder that love doesn't need lace or poetry. Sometimes, love is a comb in a quiet room. Lice, labor, and gender. The burden of lice management fell unevenly across genders. Women were more likely to be the ones doing the grooming, whether for children, husbands, or employers. Girls were taught from a young age to inspect clothing and bedding for signs of infestation, and older women were respected for their knowledge of herbal treatments and preventative care. In some households, this domestic authority gave women unexpected power. A wife might control when the linens were washed or what oils were applied to scalps. Her attention to grooming became part of how she cared for and organized the home. But it wasn't always easy. When infestations grew severe, it was often a source of shame, particularly for women whose role included maintaining clean homes. Letters from the period show mothers apologizing to married daughters for sending them home with creature-laden cloaks. The emotional weight of such exchanges ran deep. Yet for all its hardship, grooming gave women a rare space of influence, place where care, knowledge, and love all came together, no matter how humble the materials. Threads of affect. The end of the Tudor period, clothing had grown more elaborate, but lice remained. Velvet, wool, and linen all hosted them with ease. Elaborate ruffs and layered garments made infestations harder to control and easier to spread, and still, people carried on combing, picking, checking one another's collars. This wasn't just about getting rid of parasites. It was about staying human in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. It was about showing that someone saw your discomfort, your scalp, your skin, and still chose to touch you gently. In the age before antibiotics, before central heating, before shampoo, the most human things were small. A comb, a lap, a shared silence in a room lit by fire, reflections in the shadows. So what can lice-picking tell us about romance? That perhaps love has always been less about grand gestures and more about the everyday acts that make life bearable. In Tudor England, where courtship was often arranged, an affection had to fight through layers of hardship and restraint. It was in the humblest rituals, grooming, checking, tending, that people found ways to care. Lice were never welcome, but the acts built around their removal Those became the quiet language of love. And maybe, if you squint back through the soot-smudged windows of time, you'll see two figures seated by the fire. No roses, no serenades, just one leaning in, gently parting the other's hair, looking for a sign of discomfort and smoothing it away.